You should be grateful we even invited you." That was the first thing Margaret said when I stepped into the dining room. Not hello. Not Merry Christmas. Not even a fake smile. Just that. Sharp, cold, and loud enough to carry over the clink of wine glasses and the quiet hum of holiday jazz playing from the speakers near the mantle. I had barely set down the pie I brought, store-bought because my oven broke last week, when all eyes turned to me. And none of them looked kind. The table was set for 12. The good china, crystal glasses, gold napkin rings shaped like reindeer antlers. My ex-mother-in-law always did have a flair for drama. The chandelier above the table shimmered just enough to make my thrifted dress look even cheaper under the light. "Grateful?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. She didn't blink. "You've taken enough from this family. The least you could do is show some manners." And just like that, every eye in the room decided it was easier to look down at their plates than at me. Even Roger, my ex-husband, just kept carving the ham like none of it was happening. His new wife, Elise, smiled like this was a scene from a movie she'd already seen too many times. My brother-in-law chuckled, took a sip of his wine, and muttered something I couldn't hear. But I knew it wasn't kind. I reached down to steady my daughter's hand. Grace was 11. Old enough to understand, but too young to have to pretend this didn't hurt. Her fingers tightened around mine. Her eyes didn't leave Margaret's. "I didn't come here to take anything," I said softly. "I came because Grace wanted to see her grandparents." "Well," Margaret sniffed, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "Now she's seen us. You can leave the pie and go." The room didn't gasp. There were no dramatics. Just a stillness, like the kind before a storm, or maybe after one has passed and left nothing behind. I opened my mouth, then shut it again. Not here. Not in front of my daughter. Not when I could feel the burn in my eyes already. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but I wasn't sure who I was saying it to. Maybe to myself. Maybe to Grace. And then, "Mom," Grace said, her voice calm, too calm for an 11-year-old. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something older. Steadier. "You don't have to say sorry." I turned to her. She let go of my hand and stood up straighter. Her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, and for the first time that evening, she didn't look like a child. She looked at Margaret, then Elise, then Roger, one by one, with eyes that didn't flinch. Then slowly she reached into her backpack and pulled out a sealed envelope. Plain, white, quiet. She set it on the table, right in front of Margaret, careful, deliberate. No one moved, no one dared. And then Grace said, softly but clearly, "Grandpa didn't forget us. You just hoped he did." That was it. The smile dropped from Elise's face. Margaret's hand froze mid-reach for her wine glass. Roger blinked once, twice, and the room fell absolutely still. The thing about peace is, it doesn't arrive with a bang. It sneaks in, quietly, on ordinary days. Like the first morning Grace and I moved into the lake house, the air still smelled like cedar and rain. The walls still echoed with someone else's memories. And yet, as sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows and hit her hair just right, I remember thinking, this is ours now. Not because we fought for it, but because we stopped waiting for permission to belong. Grace decorated her room herself, taped her drawings to the walls, lined her windowsill with smooth lake stones. She planted marigolds outside and named every squirrel in the backyard like they were neighbors we'd been meaning to meet. She laughed more, ate more, slept deeper. And me, I stopped bracing for impact. No more waiting for the next comment, the next cold shoulder, the next time someone called me too much. Or not enough. I didn't need their seat at the table anymore. Because we'd built our own. There were still hard days, of course. Grief has a way of echoing even in quiet rooms. Sometimes Grace would look out over the lake and ask, "Do you think Grandpa's proud of us?" And every time I'd say the same thing. "He was proud of you that night. I think he always was." We didn't dwell in bitterness. We didn't look back to see who was watching. We just kept living. Pancakes on Saturdays, walks by the water, books in bed. We reclaimed softness. We made room for joy. And one evening, while I was doing the dishes and Grace was at the table, painting the sky in her sketchbook, she said something that stopped me cold. "You know, Mom," she said, her voice low, "you didn't just teach me how to be strong." I looked up. "No?" She shook her head. "You taught me how to stay kind, even when it hurt." That night, after she went to bed, I stood by the window for a long time. The lake was still. No wind. No waves. Just the reflection of the moon on glassy water, and the faint rustle of leaves reminding me we were still here. Still standing. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Not even to myself. Because healing doesn't look like a clean slate. Sometimes it's just a moment of stillness after years of noise. A dinner where no one flinches. A child who knows she's safe enough to speak. A woman who doesn't shrink anymore when someone says her name. So if you're watching this right now, and you've been made to feel small, unwanted, ungrateful for asking to be treated with basic dignity, this is for you. You are not too much. You are never not enough, and maybe you didn't get the apology you deserved. Maybe the will wasn't rewritten in time. Maybe no one stood up for you in the room where it counted. But that doesn't mean your truth isn't real. It doesn't mean your worth has expired, because sometimes the loudest kind of justice is just living well. Sometimes the most radical act of love is continuing to be kind in a world that told you to harden. So if you've ever felt erased by family, by silence, by betrayal, let this be your reminder. You get to take up space. You get to heal, even if no one claps for it. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is what Grace did. Not shout, not argue, just stand. Stand up for someone who's been quiet too long. Or maybe, finally, stand up for yourself. If this story spoke to you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real, quiet, powerful, don't forget to subscribe, because your story matters too. And we'll be right here, ready to listen. I don't think the silence broke for a full day after we left that house. Not really. Oh, the messages started pouring in, of course, the carefully worded ones, the passive apologies disguised as questions. Is Grace okay? We didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe we should talk. I didn't respond to any of them, because by then, something in me had already shifted. For so long, I thought I needed their recognition to feel real. To feel like I belonged somewhere, even if that place was chipped and cold and came with caveats. I thought if I tried hard enough, bit my tongue long enough, smiled small enough, they'd let me in. But Grace, my 11-year-old daughter, had walked into that house and told the truth with nothing but her voice and her spine and a sealed envelope. And suddenly, their approval felt small. The next day, the lawyer confirmed what we already knew. The will was valid. The hospital records matched. The nurse gave her sworn statement. There was no loophole, no gray area to manipulate. My name was there, mine and Grace's. Clearly, irrefutably. The house, the lake lot, 40% of the business shares. They were ours. Margaret's silence lasted Lonnie ones, but it didn't hold. About a week later, I ran into her at the grocery store. She was walking toward the bakery section when she spotted me. Her steps slowed. She looked smaller, tired in a way I hadn't seen before. She didn't smile, didn't pretend. She just said, "I didn't think he'd do it." I paused, loaf of sourdough in my hand. "He did." Margaret nodded once, then added, almost too soft to hear, "and I didn't think she'd be brave enough to keep it." I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure if she meant me or Grace. But either way, she was wrong. 2 days later, Roger called, not to apologize, at least not at first. He wanted to meet. To clear the air, he said. But I could hear it in his voice. That tremor behind the smooth, the unease of a man who thought he had a plan and suddenly didn't. We met at a small cafe, halfway between my apartment and his office. Grace stayed home. She didn't need to see him shake. Roger showed up in his pressed shirt and tie, still playing the part of a man in control. But his eyes gave him away. He asked how I was, how Grace was. I answered simply. Then he said it. "The board's reviewing everything. They're not happy." Turns out, keeping a legal will from a direct heir, especially one involving business shares, is a serious offense in a family-owned company. Elise's name was never on the business, but she'd been acting like it. Roger had let her sit in on meetings, speak on behalf of shareholders. Now it was all unraveling. "They're questioning my judgment," he added quietly. "My leadership." I sipped my coffee. "Maybe they should." He looked at me like he wanted to argue. But there was nothing left to fight with. "You don't have to push me out," he said. "We can share control." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm not interested in control," I said. "Just honesty and space." He nodded. But he knew. The board didn't want a man who lied to his own family. and I didn't want a man who needed reminding that his daughter mattered. When I stood to leave, he didn't follow. And that, I think, was the beginning of the end for him. As for Elise, her fall was quicker. Without access, without title, without the leverage she thought marriage gave her, she faded fast. Margaret tried to defend her, but no one was listening anymore. Not after the recording. Not after the will. Truth has a way of stripping noise from a room, and once it's quiet, you start to notice who really matters. Grace and I didn't celebrate. Not in any loud way. We just made pancakes the next Saturday. Ate them in pajamas. Sat on the living room floor, legs tangled up like always. She turned to me mid-syrup drizzle and said, "You know, I wasn't scared." I looked at her strong, steady eyes. "I know," I said, and for the first time in years, I really did. For a long, slow moment, no one moved. You could hear the chandelier hum, the soft buzz of electricity. The ticking clock in the hallway suddenly sounded thunderous. And then, Margaret did something she hadn't done all night. She looked directly at me. No pretense. No passive-aggressive tilt of the head. Just cold, measured calculation behind her eyes. Like she was trying to solve me. "How dare you bring that here?" she finally said, her voice low and trembling. Not with fear, but fury. "You think this is funny? Coming in here, stirring up trouble, using a child." "She's not being used," I said. It came out steady. Not loud, not shaky, just clear. Everyone turned to look at me then, as if remembering I still had a voice. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Instead, she reached into her backpack again and pulled out a small black device. It was a recorder. I felt my heart hiccup. Margaret's face paled. "What is that?" Elise asked, suddenly not smiling anymore. Grace held it carefully, like it was something sacred. She glanced at me for a moment. I nodded once. Then she pressed play. The sound was muffled at first, a cough, a shuffle, the whir of oxygen, and then came the voice. "I don't have much time, so listen." It was him, my father-in-law, Grace's grandfather. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but still him. Clear. Deliberate. Recorded the night before he passed, just like Grace had told them. I felt the entire room tighten. "I've made mistakes," the recording continued, "and I've let pride stand in the way of what's right. But I see things clearer now. That woman, that girl, she never asked for anything but to be part of this family." The room held its breath. She raised Grace with dignity, alone, while we pretended she didn't exist. Margaret stood up fast. Her chair screeched behind her. "Turn it off," she snapped, but Grace didn't move. She stayed kind, the voice said, softer now. "Even when we weren't. I want her to have the house, and the lake lot, and the business shares. All of it goes to her and Grace. They are my legacy." Gasps, real ones this time. Roger looked like someone had punched him in the ribs. Elise muttered, "No, this can't be." But Grace wasn't done. She opened the envelope. Inside wasn't just the will. There was a notarized letter, a statement, a legal copy with his signature, the date, the witness stamp. I didn't know she had all of it. She handed it to Roger. "Dad gave this to me," she said. "He said to hold it, to wait." Roger stared at the paper like it might bite him. Elise grabbed it from his hands, scanning it frantically. "This isn't valid," she hissed. He was sick. He wasn't thinking straight. He had it notarized at the hospital," Grace said calmly. "There's a witness, one of the nurses. She signed too." Margaret turned a shade I didn't know human skin could turn. Like rust and ash mixed together. Grace walked back to me. And then said the 7 words I didn't even know I needed to hear. "He didn't forget you." I remembered him. Margaret sat back down slowly. Not with grace, not with power, but like someone whose body had finally caught up with the truth. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her lips parted, then just stayed there, trembling, dry. Across the table, Elise still clutched the will like it might dissolve in her hands. Her eyes darted between the legal stamps, the signature, the date, and Grace. And Roger? He just looked at his daughter like he'd never seen her before. He had always seen her as a child. Something delicate, easy to distract, easier to dismiss. But in that moment, watching her stand there with her chin held high, her voice steady, her presence commanding, I think he realized he'd underestimated her. Like they all had. Grace didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just stood in that hush, like the center of gravity had moved to her feet and let them feel the weight of it. I watched her fingers loosen, her shoulders lower by just a breath, and then she turned to me, barely above a whisper. "It's done, Mom." I didn't know what to say. My heart was doing so many things at once, beating too fast, breaking, healing, stretching wide open. The room felt too small for what she had just done, and too big for the silence that followed, until Roger finally cleared his throat and said, "Why didn't he tell us?" Grace answered without hesitation, "Because he didn't trust you to listen." The words didn't sting like an insult, they landed like a fact. Clean. Honest. Roger blinked, swallowed, and stayed quiet. The rest of the table? No one dared to make eye contact. Margaret fidgeted with her napkin. Elise tried to pour herself another glass of wine, but her hand shook. The bottle clinked against the rim. Grace picked up the recorder, the envelope, the letter. She didn't hand them to anyone else. She didn't need to. She had made the truth visible, and that was enough. Then, with a calm that no 11-year-old should have had to carry but somehow did, she turned to me and said, "Ready to go?" I nodded. She held out her hand, and together we walked past that long, silent table, past the china they hadn't let me touch for years, past the people who had made sure I felt small, unworthy, invisible. And we didn't shrink. Not this time. Not anymore. As we reached the hallway, I heard someone call my name, quietly, hesitant. It was Roger. He stood there, his voice tight. I didn't know. I stopped, just for a second. Then I said, "You didn't ask." We stepped outside. The cold hit our faces like a kind of baptism. Grace exhaled, long and slow, like she had just released something that had lived inside her far too long. And I looked at her, not just as my daughter, but as my anchor, my mirror, my unexpected voice in a room that had tried so hard to silence us. That night, she didn't just stand up for me. She reminded me that sometimes the truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud. The minute we stepped inside, I knew we shouldn't have come. The warmth I had imagined, the flicker of recognition, the softening in Margaret's eyes, wasn't there. Not even close. What greeted us was silence, tight-lipped smiles, a faint clatter of silverware and the rustle of napkins being adjusted like shields. The house smelled of rosemary and judgment. Someone had gone all out on the decor. Twinkling lights wrapped around the banister, candles lined the fireplace, little name cards resting on folded napkins. I noticed them as soon as we were ushered into the dining room. Everyone had a spot lined up perfectly. Except us. There was no card with my name, or Grace's. I stood there holding the pie, awkward and exposed, until Margaret finally gestured toward a tiny side table near the window. "For the extras," she said without meeting my eyes. "Hope you don't mind." I did, but I smiled. Grace looked at me like she wanted to say something, but I shook my head slightly. Not yet. I pulled out the chair for her. It wobbled. The cushion was thinner than the others. She sat down without complaint. I took the seat beside her, trying not to notice how Elise had taken mine, the one I always used to sit in, right next to Roger. She was wearing pearls. Real ones, I think. Her lipstick matched the cranberry sauce. Conversations swirled around us like steam we couldn't touch. Someone was talking about a new vacation home. Someone else about a promotion. Elise made a joke about inflation-proof husbands, and everyone laughed a little too loudly. No one asked how Grace was doing in school. No one asked where we lived now. No one looked until they did. It happened just after the main course was served. A roast. Margaret insisted on carving herself, even though the effort made her hands tremble slightly. She wore the act like a crown. She paused when she got to us, held up the carving knife like a prop in a play. "Well," she said, "hope Grace isn't too picky. This isn't one of your drive-through dinners." The table went still. The smile didn't leave her lips, but her eyes cut sharp as a scalpel. I blinked, hard. Grace stared down at her empty plate. Her knuckles were white around her fork. Roger cleared his throat but didn't say anything. Elise sipped her wine, still smiling. I started, but Margaret had already moved on, placing thick slices onto the next guest's plate, humming under her breath like she hadn't just humiliated me in front of my daughter. The heat crept up my neck. I reached for the water glass, just to have something to do with my hands. Then came dessert. I watched them pass around Elise's homemade pumpkin cheesecake, each person complimenting her like she was the queen of autumn. No one touched the pie I brought. It sat on the edge of the counter, unopened. I felt Grace's hand on my knee. That's when I saw it. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shrinking, she was watching all of it. And her eyes weren't scared. They were deciding. After dessert, Elise stood and tapped her spoon against her glass. I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for being here, she said, her voice syrupy sweet. This year's been full of blessings, new beginnings, and family, of course. She turned to Margaret, then to Roger, who raised his glass half-heartedly. And I think we can all agree, she went on, eyes sweeping the table, that this family has never felt more united. A beat of silence followed, and then Margaret, always the performer, sighed theatrically and placed her hand on Elise's. So true, darling, so true. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. The message was clear. This was their family now. I was a footnote, a former chapter they'd collectively agreed not to reread. I should have left then, should have taken Grace's hand, walked out into the night, and spared us both the weight of what came next. But something inside me, pride, pain, maybe just plain stubbornness, kept me in that chair. Margaret stood next. Before we wrap up, she said, her voice rising just enough to fill the room, I'd like to say something about legacy, about gratitude. My stomach clenched. See, she continued, in this house, we value appreciation. We don't hand things to people just because they expect it. We reward loyalty, respect. Her gaze landed on me now, direct, icy, and we certainly don't owe anything to those who've walked away. I didn't respond. My throat was too tight. She turned to Grace. Darling, she said, voice honeyed now. One day when you're older, you'll understand why some people just don't belong at certain tables. That did it. My chair scraped back against the hardwood as I stood. Not to yell, not to make a scene. Just to breathe. But Grace stood with me. I hadn't noticed she was holding her backpack again until she reached inside. Her fingers curled around something. Roger finally looked up. What are you doing, Grace? She didn't answer. Not yet. She placed a small hand on my back, steady and sure, and then she stepped forward. No longer the quiet little girl sitting on the sidelines, she walked past Elise, past Roger, and placed the sealed envelope, that envelope, back on the center of the table. Right in front of Margaret. No announcement, no demand, just silence. And then, in the hush that followed, Grace turned to them all and said, calmly, You all pretend Grandpa didn't change his mind. There was a shift in the air, a flicker of something sharp behind Margaret's eyes. Elise's jaw tensed. Roger opened his mouth, closed it. Grace didn't flinch. I watched him write it, she said, softer now. The night before he died. Margaret reached for the envelope. Her fingers hovered just above it. But Grace pulled it back. Not yet, she said. You can wait, just like we did. And then she walked back to me. Reached for my hand. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt her thumb brush the tear from my cheek. We didn't say anything as we stood there side by side while the entire table sat frozen. Because sometimes the loudest thing in a room is the one person finally deciding to stop being quiet. There was a time Margaret used to braid my hair. She'd hum Patsy Cline while she did it, soft and off-key, her fingers surprisingly gentle for a woman who carried so much steel in her posture. That was before Roger and I got married, when I was still just the sweet girl who brought peach cobbler to Sunday dinners and remembered everyone's birthdays without needing to be reminded. Back then, she used to tell people I was the daughter she never had. And I believed her. Even after the wedding, when the compliments turned into suggestions, how to raise Grace, how to dress for church, how I should let Roger lead more, I still held on to that version of her. The version that smiled and called me darlin'. The version that held my hand when I miscarried our second child and said, God's timing, sweetheart. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that version of her began to vanish. It wasn't a clean break. It was a slow erosion. The first crack came the year Roger started working for his father's firm full-time. Late nights, last-minute business trips, missed recitals, and forgotten anniversaries. He said it was temporary. For us, he'd promise with that crooked smile I used to find charming. Then came Elise. She started as Roger's assistant, young, ambitious, with that effortless kind of beauty that didn't need makeup and a laugh that somehow always made me feel smaller. At first, I didn't worry. I trusted him. Even when Grace said, Daddy smells different when he hugs me now, I told myself not to spiral. But Margaret, she changed overnight. Suddenly, nothing I did was enough. My peach cobbler was too sweet. My clothes too casual. Grace's drawings on the fridge were a bit childish for her age. And when I brought up Roger's absences, she looked at me like I just accused her son of a crime. "He works hard to provide," she said. "Maybe try supporting him instead of making it all about you." That sentence, it rewired something inside me. I stopped trying so hard after that, not because I gave up, but because I started to see the pattern. By the time Roger asked for a separation, Margaret didn't even pretend to be shocked. She sent me a box of Grace's things from their house the next day, folded too neatly, like my daughter had become a guest they were politely asking to leave. I remember holding one of Grace's t-shirts to my face that night, breathing in her scent, trying not to cry too loud. She was only 8. She didn't understand what was happening. All she knew was that suddenly, every other weekend meant Daddy's new place. And don't mention Mommy too much. Still, I tried to stay kind, to stay generous. For Grace. I invited Margaret to Grace's school play. She never responded. I mailed Christmas cards with pictures of Grace in them. They were never acknowledged. On her 9th birthday, Grace asked why Grandma hadn't called. I told her maybe the line was busy. It wasn't busy. It was blocked. Roger remarried quietly. Elise posted one photo from the ceremony, her in a white jumpsuit holding a champagne flute, Roger's arm around her waist. Margaret stood behind them, beaming like Elise had always been the daughter she truly wanted. No one told me about the wedding. Not even a courtesy text. Grace found out when one of her classmates said, "My mom saw your dad's wedding on Facebook." She cried that night. Not because she wasn't invited, because they didn't even think she'd care. And yet, through all of it, Grace never turned bitter. She grew quieter, yes. More observant, but not angry. Not the way I was. She'd still ask to call Grandpa on his birthday, even when he didn't pick up. Still wanted to draw pictures for Grandma on Mother's Day, even if we never knew where to send them anymore. She held on longer than I did. And that's probably why I said yes when she asked if we could go to the family dinner this year. Even though I knew Elise would be there. Even though Margaret hadn't spoken to me in 3 years. Even though I hadn't stepped into that house since the divorce. "I just want to see Grandpa," she said. Just that. And something in me, a tired, trembling something, wanted to believe maybe things had shifted. That maybe old wounds had softened around the edges. That maybe Margaret would see Grace's face and remember what it felt like to hold her as a baby. That maybe, if we showed up open-hearted, they'd meet us halfway. So I curled my hair. I wore my best dress. I even made a pie. Grace picked out earrings for me, small silver stars. She said they made me look strong. And as I zipped up her coat and looked into her big, hopeful eyes, I told myself one simple, fragile thing. Maybe this time, they'll see us differently.